Impact Teams Radio. Welcome to Impact Teams Radio, the show where we explore what it takes to be a leader of the leaders in corporate America. Get ready to be inspired and discover proven tips for going from average to exceptional. Now, here's your host and guide, Tony Sherman.
Hello, and it's Tony Sherman from Impact Teams Radio. And this week I have a treat for you. This week we have a return guest. We have Jim Bohn, our very own blue-collar scholar. And today Jim and I are going to do a deep dive on something that he's very, very keen on. But before we do, as I listened to the last episode, I was mentioning to you about the quality of Jim's articles in LinkedIn, and I couldn't remember the article that had tweaked my mind at the time. I looked it up afterwards, and what I found was it's on LinkedIn. It's called Being Mindful of Our Limitations, Neurology in Leadership. I really like what Jim wrote there. Did you enjoy writing that article, Jim?
I did. There are people that are very brilliant on the subject of brain science, and it's very interesting to me as well. But through my years of experience, I've noticed that organizations sometimes get very, very excited about the latest shiny object. The danger with that, especially with something as powerful as brain science, is that we need to be careful about that and take our time with it. It doesn't mean we can't use it, but we need to be cautious as we go through that. So I really did enjoy it, and clearly that article is very brief compared to what could be written on the subject. And I don't mean to diminish the science behind it, but organizations need to exercise caution as they use that.
Absolutely. And your message was loud and clear about the shiny object thing. But again, what I enjoyed the article, but I enjoyed the interaction below it. It was good. And seriously, I don't want to take away too much fun out of it, but your concept of going to the hippocampus campuses to do that, to do the I can't even pronounce it, amygdala hijack workshops, it was just so funny. So anyway, first let me be polite and say, welcome back, Jim. Thank you very much for coming again.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, sir. I appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. So this week, Jim and I, in our discussions, we're talking about something that he's very focused on, which isn't just, obviously he's focused on high-quality leadership. We saw that last time. But he's got this presentation, which is very powerful, called The 8 Leadership Blind Spots. And Jim and I are just going to spend some time on this episode having a look at the potential blind spots of leaders. So, Jim, why don't you introduce the subject to us?
Well, I'll introduce it with a story. As I've mentioned last time, my father was the biggest influence on my life. He was a very determined blue-collar man. He was a very capable mechanic, but sometimes his communication skills were lacking. And I remember one time that I was laying under an automobile, and he said, "Hand me the crescent wrench." And I was probably 8 years old, and I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. And so that just sort of prompted me to say that was one of his blind spots, even as he was leading me as his father. But I started to watch that inside of organizations as well, that there were blind spots that leaders had. It's unintentional very often, but there are things that they're not thinking about that can actually negatively influence their team members, and I've been guilty of them all myself. So I'm not telling tales to anyone else. So the goal of the presentation was to give people a chance to think about areas that they might be failing so that they stop for a moment, think about the blind spot, and improve the work that they have with their teams.
And I like blind spot number one. As soon as I read it, it was like it took me back to when I was a young teacher in a college of further education, and I was struggling with my prep work. And my mentor at the time said I was over-preparing, I was overthinking it. He said, "Tony, you're assuming that everybody knows what you know, and you've got to find something new and sparkly for them. Don't teach them everything that you know. Teach them what they need to know."
There you go.
Too often we assume that everybody knows what we know, and that was your blind spot number one, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was, and I've seen this happen very often in organizations where you go into a meeting and terms are used or acronyms are used or even projects are mentioned. And people, because they want to save face, they'll not mention it, and they'll go out of the room and say, "What was he talking about?" And sometimes that happens because executives are so busy developing new initiatives, they'll talk about them and think about them for weeks and even months, and then spring them on people as if people would know what they were talking about. So that's really an important one. We assume other people know what we're thinking about. And it doesn't take that long to correct that blind spot. It's like If you look around the room, you see body language that indicates that people don't know what you're saying. You don't need to embarrass it. You can just say, oh, by the way, that means this. You help them out, and you actually help yourself out because now they can move forward as well. So that's a big one.
Right. In fact, you get it in marriages. I tell you what, my wife will spring something on me, and it used to cause a lot of tension in the early years. But nowadays, I've learned something where I say to her, hey, Siobhan, you've been thinking about that a lot recently, haven't you? And she says, how do you know? I said, because you're halfway through the thought process. I have no idea what you're talking about. What are you talking about, dear?
Well, my wife does the same thing, Tony. She says, context, please.
Yeah, actually, thank you. I'll borrow that one as well. So what other blind spots are there out there, Jim?
Well, I think another one that's really deadly is that leaders often create the world in their own image. And what I mean by that is they may have had a great experience with a former company, and so they'll bring it into a new company and try to replicate everything that they know and that they're comfortable with. Even in our last episode, I talked about unintended favoritism, and you brought up the fact that it's human nature to sort of default to things that we're comfortable with. But I see leaders do this. They'll look at their past successes, and they'll try to use those successes in the current state, and that is literally creating the world in your own image, the things that you know. The risk there is that you may be dead wrong. And if you're intent on maintaining the things that you think are true and not listen to your team, you could be building something that's an absolute failure. I saw that with an organization that I was with, where someone came from a very high-powered company, had some big successes there, came into the organization that I was in, and tried to apply the same things, and it didn't work. It was just his comfort level with what he had done before, thinking that he could sort of bootstrap it and make it work again. But there's no excuse for just the hard work of taking a good idea, but making sure that you get team input and not just create things the way you think they should be.
Actually, that makes a lot of sense. One, that we would do it, and two, that last bit that you said, because if you think about it and you put it to a leader this way and said, hey, let's do this with a totally ill-equipped team, they will push back immediately and say, well, no, you can't do that. And you say, so let's make sure that however we execute this goal, we do it in a way that we use the strengths and weaknesses of the team that we've got. Because when you try to cookie cutter it from the last company, you're totally ignoring the strengths, the weaknesses, the culture of where you are now. Maybe not intentionally, but that's what you're doing. You're trying to achieve a goal with a weaker team.
And the reality is you're assuming that it's going to work, and that I've seen people do that regularly. They'll assume that because their strategy and mental frameworks worked in the past, it will work in the present case, and that's rarely true without a lot of hard work.
Yes, absolutely. So what else have we got? I mean, there's a couple. What other blind spots do you know about?
Well, one of the other ones is I think leaders send conflicting signals, and I think it happens because of, I talk about organizational attention deficit disorder, that we're just being compounded with these days because of so many initiatives. But I think even leaders sometimes struggle to try to find the way to the surface because they're so buried. But sending conflicting signals can be, one day I tell my team to do this, the next day I tell them to do something completely opposite. And that's just really hard on a team. They don't know what the priority is. And we do that sometimes even by the amount of time that we'll apply to something as leaders, and they watch what we're applying our time to. And in the meantime, we're telling them to apply their time to something else. That's a conflicting signal. I just think sometimes we can really mess up their motivation by doing that.
You're right, because I like to make sure, I always think my first goal of success is to make sure my boss is succeeding. And I worked for a really good guy. Jerry Doyle was his name. Excellent guy, really nice guy. But one of the things Jerry used to drive me absolutely nuts about was he would say, do this, do this, do this. And I'd like, okay, got it, Jerry, and I'd be working away. And then I'd have another meeting, and he'd give me something else and slightly contradict one of the things I'm working at. And I'd inculcate that into my thinking and try and execute slightly differently. And then he'd do something eventually I got so frustrated. And my problem is I boil and then I burst. And I burst, and Jerry's like, whoa. At what point did you decide that you couldn't say no to me or stop, Jerry? So I agree with you. Leaders do send conflicting signals, but I think also if you're a team member, you have a responsibility to help the leaders know that and say, hey, I can see some incongruity here.
Yeah, I think that is important, and I think sometimes, depending upon the culture that you're in, it may be more difficult in some cultures to say no. But even in American culture, which tends to be pretty individualistic, it's pretty tough when the boss is telling you to do something and you're going to stop at that moment. I think it's tough, and so sometimes we just have to do what you're talking about. But that takes quite a bit of managerial courage to do it, and I would also offer to do that in the private area, not someplace where that boss is going to be embarrassed. But that's just a chance to talk.
Actually, I think the way to do that is not to tell him he's wrong. I personally would approach it where like, hey Jerry, you told him to do A, B, and C, and then D, E, and F, and when I try to do E, it's contradicting D. What have I missed?
Yeah, that is true. Ask them what the priority is. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and get them, because effectively, what have I missed is saying, now explain it.
One of the other blind spots that I think is real important that I want to cover, Tony, in the time that we have is the notion of sticking with things to get them done. I have one of my blind spots, number 7, is we don't stick with something long enough to induce change. Can I talk about this for a minute?
Oh, please, yes.
Well, here's what I mean. There's so much novelty in organizations, and if you think about it, when someone's coming up with a new product, people are all over the rainbow about it. They get excited and all the enthusiasm that goes with that. But to get something to become part of an organization takes deliberate, determined effort, and it takes effort over a long time. And one of my stories is that I was director of best business practice for a while. And I did a bit of a study. We had a whole bunch of teams come together and look at a best business practice. But I took 9 of those teams and I kept following them every 30 days and said, have you done these things? They brought their executives in, made sure that their executives are listening. They looked at the project plan. And those 9 teams outdid the rest of the groups that we were working with, largely because I believe that they kept on going after the same working goals, and they finally built things that became part of the DNA or the organization. We are so distracted today. We have shiny new objects coming in, and quite candidly, novelty will always win out over boredom. And when people start to get bored with the subject, or they get tired of it, or it's becoming too hard, they'll look to new things. But the hard reality for managers and leaders is you need to stay with things long enough to make sure that they become what you thought they should be when they were shiny and new. He said, this is a great idea. Let's build this parking lot over here, and these are the 10 reasons why, and we got the ROI and everything else. But as the months went by, people get tired, you change out team members. Sticking with a project until it's done is, I would say that's one of the hallmarks of my personal success, but that goes back again to the ethos of blue collar, which is you don't leave until the job is finished.
Yeah, and in fact, I'm actually looking at your notes on Blind Spot 7, and the way you phrased it is, without discipline, novelty always wins over boredom. And I like that because nobody likes the word discipline, but it's so true. It's consistency in the same direction for a long time.
And the other value of that goes back to even the customer service experience I talked about last week. There are hard things involved in managing a big change. But when you stick with it long enough, then people, again, not only you develop credibility as a leader, but then they start to get this sense of success that we did this, that all the hard work paid off, and now we can go and do some more of that. And I think leaders who develop that sense of credibility through just sticking with something, they earn an amount of esteem in organizations that they probably don't even recognize. But that's probably why it's easier for them to get things done, because they've done things. They've got things achieved. They've made it happen. So that's really a big one. I can't stress that enough, because I think managers are often defaulting to new things that come along. And if we don't get the things done that we're supposed to get done, it may look like we have a lot on our plate, but really achieve very little until that thing becomes part of the organization.
And also, while you were saying that, I was thinking about it from a personal perspective. If I've got a leader that's chasing shiny objects, well, it's nice because you always get to be at the start of something new. But effectively, what he's going to end up doing is thrashing me because I'm never going to achieve or succeed fully. So once you build the credibility through consistency, I'll follow that leader because what that says to me is this is a guy who values my work through to completion, and therefore when he asks something new to me, I'll be doing something that is going to be significant.
Right. That's just dead on. I agree with you.
So we looked at a couple of blind spots. As I'm flicking through some of your notes, I really like number 3. We talk and assume that we've been effective in our communication.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think that is just so prevalent these days in what you call the ADHD corporate culture.
Well, here's a quick story. I was working with an executive and we had a big project that we were going to do, and he walked through the hall, and I think I probably had 15 to 20 seconds of him sending me a directive to do something I had never done before. He said to me, build a storyboard for XYZ customer. And first of all, I had no idea what a storyboard was. And secondly, he said, I need it done by tomorrow morning. And this is probably like 3 in the afternoon. So had he taken 3 minutes or maybe even 5 minutes to explain precisely what he wanted, I would have been able to accomplish that work in a lot less time than the overnight work it took me to get things done that he was looking for. But he assumed that I knew what he was talking about. And that can be not only humorous, sometimes it can be deadly in circumstances like if you give people the wrong information, like I talked about in our last episode. I kind of get a kick out of the statement where I redid Rene Descartes' statement, I think, therefore I am. I put down, I talk, therefore you should know. And yes. Nothing could be further from the truth. We need to take the time, and it doesn't have to be hours, to absolutely ensure that people understood what we were requesting. And once they do, they're free to go and work. We're free to go and work, and we don't need to worry about whether that outcome is going to be poor. I know it's good old simple delegation, but it still needs to be done effectively to ensure that we've communicated with them.
And the other thing is, I think as a leader or a leader in training, the one thing that taking that 5 minutes in that story that you said, it would be a way to ensure you don't burn your people out, because you went above and beyond because that's required and he asked you. But if he does that week in, week out, he's eventually going to burn you out. And I came across a phrase, I don't know if I got it when I was reading one of your articles or someone else's, but they said, people don't leave companies, people leave leaders.
I like that. It is true. If I'm working overtime or harder to try to achieve something that I didn't understand, that's a demand of my time and a demand of my personal motivation and my personal energy. Like you said, maybe you can get through that once and overlook it, but if it happens again and again, it can burn people out. In fact, I'm confident that it does. I have probably time for one more blind spot if you're open to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, please, Jim.
Here's a big one, forgetting to check the rearview mirror. I really believe that some leaders are so intelligent and their vision is so clear to them, this goes back to some of the other conversations we've had, that they're racing miles and miles ahead of their people. And they've not checked back to see whether or not their followers are literally following them. And the followers may not even know where those leaders are going. What I've seen this happen with is with leaders that are very, very, very intelligent. And sometimes they even become impatient with their people because it's like, well, can't you see it? I can clearly see it. Let's get this work done. And that will probably distance people even more. But checking the rearview mirror in my mind is something as simple as how are we doing? 15-minute follow-up meeting or half hour. Are we on the same page? Just sort of checking in with people. That's not that hard to do, but I think the pace of life is so fast in corporations today that we just assume that people know what we're doing and they're following us, and they may not be anywhere near following us. They may be following someone else. So just once in a while, just checking in the rearview mirror and seeing if people are following us. That's a really important thing to remember.
And I would add to that, I would say, if you as a leader are somebody who's frustrated with your people because they don't get it and you do, then rather than seeing it as them not getting it, take the personal challenge of, how do I communicate this differently and more effectively so the light bulb goes off in them? Because fundamentally, if you take responsibility for the communication, as a leader, you can do something about it. If you don't, you're always going to be frustrated by them not getting it.
Sure. So now you've got two people frustrated by the lack of communication, which in the end turns out to be a waste of time for everybody and a lot of frustration. And then before long, it turns into more tension in the team. It's amazing. People talk a lot about communication. I've got some other, work out there on communication, but people talk a lot about communication. But the one thing in organizations that they just don't work hard enough at. We just assume that we're communicating because people talk, but that's not the case. And I know it's communication 101 to make sure that your receiver actually understood what you were saying. But again, it's the pace of life today, especially, that is not allowing leaders to take the time to say, okay, 5 minutes with my team. Do we all know where we're going? Just checking, looking in their eyes. And if you've got head nods from everybody and they know where you're going, good. But I don't think we're doing that enough.
And actually, one of the reasons we're not doing that enough is because I sent you the email about that on Wednesday. Didn't you get it?
Yeah, that's a big one. That's really a big one, and that just goes back to you. I probably could have avoided that email if I had picked up the phone or walked over to your desk and just ensured that. So, and because electronic communication is one way, we all know that it's very useful for some things, and I think strategically email can be used to communicate to thousands of people. But if you want to ensure that you've had communication take place, somehow you have to either get voice to voice or face to face.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with you. I'm trying more and more to be self-critical on how I use email because there are much better tools out there these days for onesie-twosie conversations.
Sure. So
the problem is also with that, though, is the other thing that I think really detracts, and it comes to this organizational ADD, is when we're in meetings, we like to do emails or restructure that spreadsheet. So we effectively multitask. And I think that adds to the pressure, the miscommunication, the not being there. So I'm trying to talk to you, but you're actually, if I'm not speaking directly at the moment, you're tempted to go and send off an email or something.
Well, and I had a brilliant leader that I worked with, and he's still in business, and he's probably one of the people that I respect the most, and he would say, in meetings, he'd say, point your finger to the air, now bring it down over the top of your laptop, now pull the top of your laptop down, and now we will begin our meeting. And that's the way he did it every time, so that there was no laptop, there was no cell phone, there was no BlackBerry, there was no smartphone. He wanted to have people's attention because he knew the value of their time, and he also wanted to ensure that the communication had taken place so they could go and do their work. He did it in a very, very diplomatic way, but they got the message.
And what I've done a few times, especially on an internal team meeting where we're talking about an external customer stuff, I'll walk around and just quickly add up the billing rates of everybody and say, this next hour is worth this. Yeah.
That really is true, and I think that's a great way to show people this is a very costly meeting. Let's use that for the benefit of not only our company but our customers.
Absolutely.
Those are the primary ones that I would want to talk about. I just think there are probably more, Tony, that people could identify. Those are the big ones that I look at, and I just think every leader, I don't care who you are, has a blind spot or two. And the one thing I would just offer as a summary to this is sometimes a trusted companion in the workplace can tell you what that blind spot is. You don't need to go to 20 or 30 people. You can just go to one or two, and if you just listen to them and they say, well, here's one of the things that you do that always is driving me crazy, that can change your life. It may only be 30 seconds, but you can learn from that. Maybe it's not looking in the rearview mirror. Maybe it's creating the world in your own image. Maybe it's communication sound bites, but something that we all do as leaders causes other people to struggle. And I think just taking the time to recognize, look, none of us is perfect as a leader. We're going to make mistakes. Let me get the feedback. Let me learn what that is so that I can be better. It's helpful for my team. It's helpful for my organization. It's better for me.
And on that note, I think we'll close out. Jim, that was a brilliant session. Thank you so much for your time.
I appreciate the opportunity to do this, sir. It's a real honor.
Oh, really enjoyed it. Okay, Impact Nation, this is Tony Sherman. I won't say go do this stuff. I would say exactly what Jim said. Find a trusted colleague in the workplace. Find out which one of these you should improve on in the next 6 months. And if you do, you'll be a far better leader in 6 months' time than you are today. Until next week, this is Tony Sherman from Impact Teams Radio.
That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. Now go and apply these few gems. Make the wisdom you have heard your own. If you want to be part of our launch success, then please go to impactteamsradio.com/love and tell the world. If you want more and never want to miss a beat, please go to impactteamsradio.com/subscribe. If you have 3 minutes, we would love to see a positive review on iTunes. And until next time, remember to act on what you've learned, and you'll be ahead of most of the world. Impact Teams Radio.